We all know the current spending path for our nation is simply unsustainable. Our national debt's grown to $33 trillion. That's $100,000 per American citizen with 330 million Americans. It's nearly 30% larger than the entire U.S. economy. We haven't had that since World War II. At the same time, Americans continue to feel the strain of the longest sustained period of excessive, reckless borrowing, spending, and deficit growth in American history. And they're being crushed by the resulting inflation and interest rate increases. The Democrats and the Biden administration are clearly not up to the task, but rather seem to be addicted to the out-of-control spending, bureaucratic tyranny, and taxation that has caused Biden inflation to run rampant. And they seem to be oblivious to the harm caused to the American people. But this Congress, this Republican-controlled Budget Committee, is trying to use our majority in the House to chart a path toward righting the fiscal ship. We need effective leadership and a willingness to enact true reforms for this to occur. This budget from Chairman Arrington balances the budget in 10 years and implements many conservative policies to stop the out-of-control spending and start solving the problem for the American people of today and of tomorrow. So we must pass this budget in order to deliver on the commitment the Republican conference and Speaker McCarthy agreed to, resetting spending levels to fiscal 22 and implementing conservative policy reforms. By passing this budget with strict spending levels for the next 10 years, we provide the roadmap for the future Congresses and administrations with the hope and expectation they will be held to the standards set forth in this budget. Passing this budget is a good faith agreement that Congress is committed to balancing the budget in 10 years and achieving $16 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years and implementing the conservative policies that the voters sent us here to accomplish with the Republican majority. The budget includes several of the measures we promised the American people we'd pursue. The REINS Act, which would stop the Biden administration's rulemaking spree that consists of 850 executive actions totaling $1.5 trillion since he took office. It includes the Limit Save Growth spending levels. It includes the Lower Energy Costs Act to restore American energy independence. The president's budget request, on the other hand, was going to result, it has been soundly rejected by this Republican Congress, but it would result in $82 trillion in spending over 10 years and $65 trillion in taxes over the same period and plunge our nation $19 trillion higher into debt. The president's plan is not in America's interest, and thankfully we have this budget instead. I support it, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back. It's clear the IRS is targeting conservative individuals and organizations on a partisan basis, knocking on doors of whistleblowers, and you name it. As a matter of fact, a few examples. In 2012, the IRS admitted they targeted conservatives for tax scrutiny in the 2012 election, and the Biden administration, of course, continues to politicize these oppressive and punitive tax collection efforts. As a matter of fact, President Biden's budget added $40 billion more to the IRS. Thankfully, that will never be voted into law. In 2021, ProPublica illegally released some wealthy individuals' tax information, and now 2 years later, the IRS leakers still have not been identified. Just last September, the IRS official who was a key player in the Lois Lerner scandal from 2014 and the subsequent cover-up was tasked by this administration to lead the new centralized office to implement the infamous IRA. Last December even, Democrats created a dangerous new precedent by releasing former President Donald Trump's tax returns. And just back in March, just days before testifying before the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, journalist Matt Taibbi had an IRS agent show up at his home. Has anybody in here ever had an IRS agent, Mr. Chairman, show up at their home? Is that a normal practice, that the IRS would show up at someone's home? I've been paying taxes now for some 40 years. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I've not yet had an IRS agent show up at my home. Back in April, just a few months ago, a whistleblower claimed in testimony that the IRS mishandled and, in fact, suffered political interference in the ongoing criminal probe into who? Hunter Biden, of course. So this amendment to increase funding to the IRS's army is bad for the American people and should be rejected. The last thing that we should do is give the IRS more money to go after more hardworking Americans. And I will remind everyone that regular income Americans, lower middle income Americans, are audited at 5 times the rate that the wealthiest of Americans are audited at. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the following letter from the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, mind you, stating that the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, which we now know had nothing to do with inflation, Mr. Chairman, but that expansion would lead to increased enforcement activities on people making under $400,000, and I ask at this time that it be introduced into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I also ask unanimous consent to submit the following press release from the IRS announcing its intent to hire more than 3,700 compliance agents nationwide to conduct expanded enforcement work. They're there to help you.
Without
and
objection.
At this time, I ask that it be introduced into the record.
So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield
The balance of your time.
9 seconds back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the Democrats and the Biden administration have willfully, purposefully facilitated the invasion taking place at our southern border over the past 2 years. And all Americans are now suffering and paying the price of the dereliction of duty demonstrated by President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, and Democrats in Congress. Since President Biden took over, Customs and Border Patrol has encountered nearly 6 million illegal aliens at the southwest border, and even worse, reports that over 1.5 million known, not counting the unknown, known gotaways have evaded U.S. Border Patrol. According to a study by FAIR, this dereliction of duty is costing Americans, taxpayers, over $150 billion annually, and that's only going to go up under these Democrat policies and those running this administration. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit a study from the Federation for American Immigration Reform titled "The Fiscal Burden of Illegal Immigration on United States Taxpayers" into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rising crime in Democrat-run cities has caused Democrats to suddenly begin to rethink their efforts, their well-publicized efforts to defund police. Even the mayor of New York City recently called for action to be taken to curb rising crime as a result of the invasion at our southern border. I wonder what he thinks of those who actually live at the southern border, those border states. I call on my Democrat colleagues to work with Republicans to secure our borders, stem the flow of illicit drugs like the chemical weapon fentanyl, and secure domestic peace and tranquility by funding local police, prosecuting criminals, and ending no-cash bail. But this amendment would simply throw money at the problem and fail to truly solve the issues caused by this Biden administration and these individuals who run our blue cities, these Democrat individuals who run our big cities. So I recommend a no vote on this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the remarks by Mr. Trone, but despite his impressive business experience and success, if he ran his business and spent money and borrowed money the way the federal government does, he would have been out of business and wouldn't have had the success that he's had. This federal government spends 130% of its GDP, or gross domestic product. That would be like our debt is 130% of our GDP. That would be like having debt that was 130% of your sales, not your income, but your sales. We'll spend some over $20,000 a citizen this year, over $20,000 a citizen at nearly $7 trillion. Only 15% of that, about $3,000, are on what should be the priority of the federal government. Could you imagine a business that only 15% of what it spent its money on had anything to do with the real priority of the business was? So we'll spend $3,000 trying to keep the nation safe and secure, which is number one responsibility of the federal government. I suppose my friends on the other side do not agree with that, and they believe that it's the responsibility of the government to be the nanny state, to provide for and to take care of the citizens, if you will. We believe the number one responsibility of the federal government is to provide for the safety and security, and including securing and protecting our constitutionally protected rights that we believe are God-given rights. So we'll spend $20,000 per citizen this year, borrowing $6,000 of that. Borrowing $6,000 of that for every citizen, not for every taxpayer or even every household, but every citizen. We have, again, $33 trillion in national debt, which represents right at $100,000 per 330 million Americans. And what do we have to show for that? When you spend and invest in your business, you have something to show for that. What does the average citizen have to show for his or her share of $100,000 of that debt. Now, we were talking specifically about research and development investment, and the federal government, I think we all agree, and this budget reflects, does place a value on that, an appropriate value on that. However, it should be limited to that which only the federal government can do, or only that which the federal government should do, for which there is not the sufficient private incentive to do so. This budget understands the importance of ensuring the United States remains the world's leader in science and technology. This is not an easy task, as we face enormous budget challenges, as I've just mentioned, and increased global competition, specifically from China. I would like my friends on the other side to recognize the threat from China. They are not a competitive partner, as this administration seems to think. They are an existential adversary. But this budget recognizes that challenge and recognizes that communist leadership in China understands the advantages gained by being the global leader in science and innovation, is determined to surpass the United States in critical technologies. Mr. Chairman, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit the fiscal year 2024 views and estimates letter from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also just use it as an example of private versus public, or private enterprise versus the taxpayer and the federal government. In 2022, there were a total of 78 successful orbital launches into the U.S., outpacing every other spacefaring nation on Earth. Companies like Rocket Lab, Blue Origin, ULA, and SpaceX are leaps and bounds ahead of government-funded and operated programs in nations like Russia and the aforementioned China. This commercial innovation is what this budget encourages, facilitates, and fosters. And Mr. Chairman, I would also like request unanimous consent to submit a data repository from the Center for Strategic and International Studies titled Space Environment Total Launches by Country into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm thankful this budget recognizes the premium of the private sector and private investment and private enterprise, and encourages and facilitates that accordingly. And I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield back.